Welcome everybody to UTS for this Women and Sensing Forum. My name is Professor Anika Gauja. I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor Research here at the University of Technology, Sydney. I would like to begin our forum today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to acknowledge their custodianship of the land, but also their custodianship of centuries of knowledge of caring for country and caring for community. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that we have with us today. It's absolutely fabulous. This is my first sensing event as Pro Vice-Chancellor Research at the University of Technology, Sydney, and really fabulous to see so many people here today. Such a range of audience members from across academia and industry. So welcome to what I think is really, really important in showcasing a number of different things. The first is the work of absolutely fabulous researchers in the fields of health, digital health and sensing technologies, but also to acknowledge the pipeline of outstanding individuals, outstanding women who are actively contributing to this field and who are established leaders and emerging leaders in this area as well. So I think that there is something that that I certainly will be learning and taking away from today, and I can see many women in the audience. I think it's really important that we hear this fantastic work, hear about this fantastic research, but also acknowledge these outstanding women too as pioneers in this field. The forum itself provides a platform to share diverse knowledges and expertise, and it also prompts us to think about the role that sensing technologies can play in society today, in addressing some of the main and most pressing social challenges and problems. My own disciplinary background is actually in social science, and I won't indulge myself too much about this, but I've been doing a lot of work in the past few years with rural communities to understand some of the main policy and political challenges that they face, and to understand some of the sentiment of discontent, of disillusionment and disengagement in society in these particular areas, and just how much access to fundamental rights, fundamental services such as healthcare play in what we see as some of the main challenges in those communities. So our health system, we can think about it obviously in terms of clinical outcomes, but it plays such an important role in sustaining communities. And these are communities that face geographic, they face socioeconomic, and they face systemic disadvantages. So one of the key things that the forum will focus on today is really the role that sensing technologies and digital technologies could play in ameliorating some of those challenges. And the real promise of sensing technologies as shifting the focus of care to meeting communities where they are at, to providing coverage into remote areas, to really thinking about what preemptive data-driven care can do to improve health outcomes in the longer term. Sustainability is one of the key challenges that we're going to be looking at today. So the panel today will explore how these technologies can be designed and deployed to genuinely improve outcomes, particularly for the most vulnerable people in our society, and how innovation can really deliver this. So I'd like to invite our panellists up on stage. We have Professor Fang Chen, Dr. Jiao Li, and Professor Sally Inglis. If you guys could come and grab a seat, so we'll just have to take a moment here while we recalibrate the stage. I'm not going to introduce each of the panellists. I'll ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves very briefly with a little bit of a background on your area, what you do, but returning to the comment I made earlier about we have some absolutely fabulous leaders and scholars in this room. If you could just give us one sort of reflection on how you got here. It could either be a challenge or it could be a sort of a positive moment in your career that we can sort of understand that trajectory. So I'll start with you, Fang.
Thank you, Anika. Thank you. Hello?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you for Kathleen, all the people putting together this wonderful event. So I started my training in electrical engineering, remote sensing, then signal processing as master, and then AI as PhD. Then past decades, I've been working in industry, government agencies, and then coming back to academia 2019, so 7 years in university. So the passion I always have is, of course, coming from data. But data original coming from sensing, coming from all the ways of collecting, and utilizing those to apply to getting insights, getting actionable items out of the data and applied across many sectors. Health is one, and then worked with a lot of colleagues here in water, transport, energy, you name it. Because when you look at the layer, one is data layer, one is getting something out of the data. So it doesn't matter when the data translate into the abstract format, then how to get abnormal behavior, trending, all those ones make sense. Of course, how those ones engage with the real business or government, or whoever the users are, or our day-to-day basis, is how to take those ones, take actions to change different paradigm we have now. That's what we call the entire innovation ecosystem. Thank you.
This is good.
Okay, I'll keep talking before it drops off. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on this panel. It's really an honor to be here. So I'm JJ. I'm from the School of Biomedical Engineering at UTS. I was trained as a biomedical engineer, so back at Sydney Uni a while ago. And then I did a PhD in biomedical engineering, more specifically in tissue engineering, and then did a postdoc and then that moved me into the field of more regenerative medicine and stem cell research. And then in 2020, I came to UTS and started my own independent research team. So I think my intersection in terms of what I do in the field of tissue engineering and regenerative medicine, particularly using things like stem cells and biomaterials and nanotechnology to create new and better therapeutics that could potentially benefit patients, particularly in the area of musculoskeletal diseases like osteoarthritis and tendon bone injuries. I think the intersection there with sensing technologies is that it will be really great to be able to have smart therapeutic release vehicles, for instance, so like to have on-demand release of therapeutics that can respond to the body's environment, and so to be able to improve patient outcomes. So not in the sense of what AI and digital health do in terms of a population kind of community broad network perspective, but really going down to the micron and nano level to use sensing for improving and coming up with new biomedical technologies. I think from a career path perspective, I'm sort of a bit on the younger end, so I'm still in the middle of being affected by parental leave or coming back from parental leave, which is a great thing in itself, but there are some things in, particularly as women in STEM, that only women experience, and I'm sort of like there. And I also have a chronic condition that I suffer from that only affects women as well. So not to go into the details of that right now, but just to say that there are a lot of, I guess, visible and invisible challenges and also unconscious bias that we still have to battle through to just be here. And so I'm really grateful for being here and sharing my story with people. Thanks.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. That's a very impressive lineup to follow. So I'm Professor Sally Inglis. I'm a Professor of Nursing here at UTS. I'm very pleased to say it is International Nurses Day today. So a big shout out to any nurses in the room, but of course UTS is a great place for nursing study and research, #1 in Australia at the moment, which is fantastic. So I'm very pleased to be a nurse here on this panel and to contribute my, interdisciplinary perspective to this conversation. So my background is very diverse. I actually started off studying a science degree, so I actually have qualifications, laboratory-based in pharmacology. I also did a nursing degree, and then throughout my PhD and postdoc, I've sort of evolved into more evidence-based healthcare policy, translation, health services research. So I've done a whole range of different things across the lifetime of my career. I've been here at UTS for a very long period of time, and I've seen how UTS has evolved over that time. So before we even had the FEIT building, which is very impressive. So it's interesting where we're at now in 2026. And really, I guess why I'm part of this conversation today is that my research for the past 2 decades really has been focused on building the evidence and translating that into policy and then into practice to support telehealth and remote monitoring, mainly in a cardiovascular care situation. And I've just recently led a very interdisciplinary Australian-New Zealand team of co-authors to publish, I guess, a national policy, if you like, or a position statement to really embed the use of telehealth across all of adult cardiovascular care. And the passion of that for me has always been driven by this sense of inequity between metropolitan and urban areas and access to healthcare, and that for people living outside of those areas in regional, rural and remote and very remote areas. And that's my background. I grew up in a small country town, so finding myself here right in the CBD of Sydney with, healthcare right at my fingertips always makes me feel quite uncomfortable, because I realise that that is a very privileged position, and not everyone has that same access or opportunity. In terms of being a woman in this space, obviously, nursing is a career path that's taken by a lot of women, and so I always am very passionate about equity, diversity, inclusion, and supporting and mentoring women throughout their career. I also am an interesting person in the sense that I actually work part-time, which is quite rare for a professor. But I do that because I have care responsibilities, and I also live with multiple complex chronic health conditions, which are invisible. And so working part-time has enabled me to keep moving my career forward, but doing so in a way that it is balanced. But I realise that it's not the norm for someone at my level of professor to work part-time. And so I'm always a strong advocate for, equity and, putting what your needs are first, but you can still have a successful career. You can still make a contribution, but it just needs to be at a slightly different pace than perhaps the colleagues and your competitors around you. You always feel like you're maybe a little bit behind where they are, but in the end, you'll get there, and we can still make very, very valuable contributions. And I think that lived experience of being, a parent, a carer, living with chronic illness, working part-time and doing all the juggle, I think is what really adds that extra layer of depth to our research and how we're able to contribute.
That's oh, great, the mic is working. I feel that we can only use one at once, that the other one cuts out. That's a fantastic point, Sally, the lived experience as well. So we see not only a diversity of research areas, but a diversity of experiences represented on the stage too. wanted to come back. So, JJ, you mentioned your sort of take on where smart sensing can go in terms of regenerative technologies, but I wanted to continue on this trend and ask our panellists, perhaps I'll start with you, Fang, about an area that you're working on in the sensing space or the digital health technology space, and what you see in that could potentially improve healthcare outcomes, but also reduce pressure on the healthcare system, whether we conceptualise that as something like cost, workforce load, energy use, or unnecessary care that's provided. So over to you, Fang.
Which one? Thank you. Health with the sensing and the data is a fascinating area. I try to use a few examples to talk about. So one example is we work with our partners to trialing on one of the patch sensor on the skin, which you can take all the measurement of vital signs, including all the oxygen level, your heartbeat, your temperature, all those ones. And those ones, particularly trialing in the aged care facility, is looking into the early signs of a UTI, sepsis, and some more critical things. And then those ones are formulating information board for the nurses and people can do different triage, different care support. And of course, we're talking about remote communities and particularly residential care in the remote areas. Those ones, it's hard to, ring the nurses and come down to do X, Y, Z, but with a certain information provided, there's constant measuring. It's actually really small. It's a patch, you can patch everywhere. Very small, and you can get a constant data feed into that and then change into the entire care process. So it's fantastic. The second one I want to mention is we actually work with New South Wales Health on looking at the patient journey, and we got a huge amount of the data, of course, go through all the filtering necessary in terms of sensitivity, all those ones, but we have 30 years of patients, more than 80,000, got millions of records. Particularly, we're looking into the people aged above 65 with various different health conditions and looking into the potential pathways of they could spend more time in the primary care, which is like a GP or those local community services. And if we know some early signs, we know the early trajectory of one disease may trigger fundamental other conditions, which they already have in the system, and stop them or at least prevent them entering into the acute care. So, which is the hospital, ICU, all those ones. So this bump up a huge cost, and also, everyone complains about emergency rooms, how difficult it is. We can't build so many of the emergency rooms, but if we can smartly monitor those conditions progressing over the time, and then do more, primary and community-based care, that will, save a lot of money, also give priorities to people really, really needs those ones and prevent before we getting there.
Oh, okay. So you have to experience the microphone thing to actually understand how odd it feels to not know whether or not your sound is actually going to get picked up. Sally, can I throw over to you for the sort of same question, and particularly reflecting on your work in telehealth?
Yeah, look, I think the telehealth is an interesting one because I started off in this area to build the evidence for telehealth back in the early 2000s. In fact, it is 19 years last week since one of my PhD publications on this was published in the BMJ. And I actually was having a little email communication with my co-authors on that paper to say, hey, next year it's 20 years and, look where we've got to and look how things have changed in that time. But back when I was a PhD student working in that area trying to build the evidence, there was only really a handful of randomised controlled trials that looked at the evidence for telehealth in the management of people with heart failure. And over time, we've gone and updated that research, every few years so that we know how that body of evidence is built. But it was always very challenging presenting this research at conferences because back in the early 2000s and even, 2010, 2015, people were like, well, yes, but why would we sort of do remote monitoring and telehealth? The patients come in to see us or we go and visit them at home and, that's a good way of doing things. And it took a lot to really build the evidence so that we could say, no, it's safe and it actually does keep people out of hospital and we've got the evidence to support that. And then, of course, COVID happened and literally overnight it was sort of like, okay, all right, we've got to do this, and it was a mad scramble for everyone, here in Australia, globally, to adjust what they were doing and deliver, the same level of care really, but in a different way using technology. And it was interesting because, myself and my co-authors who'd worked on this work for, really almost 15 years by the time COVID rolled around, all of a sudden we're like, oh, everyone's finally getting it. We've convinced them. But it was just purely through need that everyone had to adapt, obviously. And it was really great. It was valuable to all of us. It really showed what was possible. It gave everyone the push, the health service, clinicians, patients. It pushed us all to have to accept this. A few years ago, I've always been very passionate about sort of telehealth and the use of remote monitoring to support people and to improve that access to healthcare. So I was quite concerned that we would get to this period of time, once COVID sort of moved on, that we'd go, okay, great, we'll pack away all that equipment. We don't need to worry about doing that anymore. We'll just go back to the old ways of how we did it. And I was very concerned. I thought, oh my goodness, I've worked for this for so long to get to this point and it's all going to sort of fade into some distant memory where everyone goes, oh, that's got to do with COVID, let's not do that. So I was very much wanting to drive a piece of policy or a position statement that sort of reflected on that period of time of COVID and said, no, this has had so many benefits to a vast array of different people, particularly in the cardiovascular setting, because that's where my research is focused. So it took us a couple of years to build an incredible team, I think of about 38 co-authors, cardiologists, allied health policymakers, across Australia and New Zealand, to write this position statement. And the purpose of it really was to say, this does work. It should remain part of cardiovascular care when it's safe to do so, when it's appropriate, in conversation with clinicians and patients. And it's really was my way of going, please let's not go backwards. So I'm really hoping that we've now got to the point where we can take the best of those technologies, put them into policy and practice and use them. I do think there are a lot of benefits for being able to support people in their community, in home, in various different ways using, a whole vast array from simple technology like telehealth, phone calls, video calls, up to much more advanced technology. And I think it is a way that we can actually ensure that people are safe at home, they can be supported at home, whether that's here in metropolitan Sydney, because for some people, needing to be at home can be just as important for people who can't get to a healthcare service purely because of geography and distance. So I think it sort of equals everything out for everyone, and it doesn't matter necessarily where you live. If you've got access to technology, you can access healthcare without needing to actually physically be visited by someone or make your way to a health service.
It helps if you turn it on too. Thank you, Sally. JJ, I wanted to come back to you and to shift the focus to this question about sustainability. So your area of tissue engineering and regenerative medicine, what do you see really as being the determinant of something that can make it from the lab, make it from a pilot study, just something that will be sustainable over the long term, that will be sustainable from an economic perspective and operational perspective, but also, I suppose in your case as well, in your area, a socially acceptable and sustainable type of care?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because we're doing discovery research in the lab, we could, I think as scientists and engineers, be very easily carried away about like, oh, this looks really fancy and really cool. Like, let's just compound all these design factors onto and produce this really cool product and publish a paper, which is what most of this field is kind of like, I guess, at least as lab scientists. And I think it's really important when we're developing the early stage discovery research and technologies that we keep in mind that sustainability in the long term as a medical product is that it needs to be economically viable. So does it actually, like in my case of, say musculoskeletal diseases, does it actually reduce implant failure? Does it prevent revision surgeries? Does it actually enable people to have better quality of life, restore mobility and reduce pain? Like, well, how does it actually in the end impact patients? And I think that's always really important to keep in mind of as you're developing the technology, not after you've already got this proof of concept product and now you're trying to find out what to do with it. And the other thing sort of tied to this also is that it needs to be able to, fancy products are great, but it needs to be able to embed seamlessly into the clinicians or healthcare practitioners' current workflow, because they don't have the bandwidth to go and learn a completely new product and figure out how to use a new protocol, which is in itself has risks because it's different from what they're already used to doing. So it needs to be able to integrate into their existing workflow. So say if they're already, again, like using an example, say if they already inject a therapeutic routinely into someone's knee, then if my injectable solution is a miracle product, whatever that is, then they'll be like, okay, well, I can just integrate that rather than saying, oh, do I need to do a separate new procedure for you? And obviously, the really obvious ones are like, manufacturability and scalability, because when you develop something in the lab, it could work with your, tens of samples, but then when you manufacture thousands of samples, is it economically viable and is it reproducible? Are the outcomes in the patient reproducible as well? And then there's also like regulatory considerations as well. I guess in terms of what I'm working in, because we're working with stem cells and cell-derived products and stuff, I think major regulatory agencies around the world, like the FDA, etc., have not really figured out their head around what to do with this class of product. And so I guess it's better to sort of pitch it or develop it in a way with this in mind, that if you can tap into a class of products that is more drug-like rather than stem cells, what are they, would be, helpful. I think all of these sort of factors that influence long-term sustainability really need to be taken into account at the very early stage discovery research stage, because they automatically makes the product more translatable and more sustainable in the future when they get implemented in the community.
Terrific, thanks, JJ. Fang, how are you navigating these challenges in your work?
I add a different lens on that, on the sustainability is myself and the team work a lot of taking, not only on the research, but also taking research into the usable product or deployment. In that sense, we consider a lot in terms of the data feeding, whether those ones consistently with the sustainable that you can supply on at the cost which we can afford. Also, what's the best way of sustainable models that will AI models use energy, use all those ones, how we can craft a reasonable small model, consume less computing power if we know more on those features. Right, one example, not in health, which is Peter and I worked together on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, one of the iconic project we're always proud of. We put more than 4,000 sensors on the bridge, and on the structure health. It's not the human health, structure health. And the question, sustainable question is how, what's the frequency we get the data, use data, store data, transmit data. Of course, I mean, as a critical infrastructure, if you frequently transmit data, itself is a risk. And also the computing power, all those ones is a risk. So we have to come up with a smart solution, which is eventually the event trigger. Some of the solutions you only take as minimum as possible data, as the sustained data, so that you can take and still monitor those abnormal situations, etc. So the layer I was talking is the sustainability of the continuous using of the technology, both on the data and then model perspective, so that we can have a carry on continuous effect or impact in real life. So.
Fantastic. And I think that, I mean, Harbour Bridge, structural health, human health, I think that there's very, very, yes, very, very close parallels there, particularly when it comes to data collection, the impact of data collection, the sustainability of that exercise. Thank you. Sally, would love a clinicians and nurses perspective on this question of sustainability.
It is. Look, this is another aspect of my research program actually, is kind of the climate change and the environment and the implications on health, particularly cardiovascular health. So I feel like I was an early advocate in this space, because also one of the studies in my PhD in the early 2000s looked at the impact on climate on heart failure hospitalisations. So I feel like I was way ahead of the curve. And also then just in the last few years, I've also published a Australian-New Zealand call to action for cardiovascular nurses on climate change and health and nursing care and adapting it. And of course, central to that is also technology, because as we have found through, extreme weather events, through infectious, causes such as COVID, through now, issues to do with petrol and transportation, that maintaining access to healthcare despite any of these challenges that might be happening in our local environment, in our national, global environment around us, that technology is a way to address and overcome those challenges. So I see that these two things go together so well. In terms of speaking about sustainability and the data, the one thing that is really, from that sort of clinician perspective, is that you really should only be collecting and looking at data that you're actually going to act upon. And this was always a bit of a point of conflict, over the last 2 decades or so of looking at, things of remote monitoring, particularly, if I put it in my perspective of people with cardiovascular conditions, because you don't want to just be collecting data for the sake of it. There's then a responsibility for someone to look and analyse that data and act upon that data. And this has always been, some of the challenges I think that have come around with, accepting remote monitoring, is that, well, who deals with the data? What do you do with the data? How do you go back to the patient and say, look, we've collected this from you remotely today and we've got a problem? It used to be an issue going back, say, 10 or so years ago, where cardiologists were particularly concerned about this, and they're like, we're going to need additional staff, they're going to have to work 24 hours a day, how are we going to manage this? Of course, now we've sort of evolved into the era of AI, and that obviously is addressing some of those concerns. Various different commercial products have, come on the market to sort of, deal with the remote monitoring and analysing the data, but it's still that very principle of, you should only really be collecting something from people if it has a clinical benefit and if you are going to do something with that data. And I think, for people, when we start to implement, technology into their life, we need to have that conversation with them that what is the purpose of why we're collecting this? How is it going to influence or alter or inform their care? Not that we're just collecting it for the sake of it and it's going into a database somewhere and it's not going to, add value. So I think keeping that in mind is really important. But the one thing, and I know this principle really applies for our colleagues, in engineering and IT, but is who is that end user? Who is going to use that product? Who's going to use the data that comes from that product? Or that platform. And, very much nowadays in health research, we talk a lot about co-design. So co-designing these solutions, but even, the trials are co-designed, with patients, with clinicians, with policymakers, devices, the protocol that we might follow. So I think, rather than necessarily starting out and thinking this is the great idea, it is working with who are going to be involved, who's going to use that data to begin with, so that whatever it is, whether it's a product or a protocol or a policy, all of that work that goes into getting to that stage has actually, met the needs of the people who are going to use that going forward. Because none of us want to be doing things that get stuck on a shelf and don't actually inform and, make people's lives better. So that's, I think, a really important principle that really underpins that sustainability question.
I think that's a great segue as well, thinking about meeting the needs of the people too. The final question that I wanted to ask of you before we go to audience questions, so that's just a cue for everyone to assemble your thoughts and any questions you may have for the panellists today, is the issue of equity and accessibility in digital healthcare. So I wanted to ask each of you your reflections on whether the technological advancements that you're seeing in your fields are addressing these inequalities, or in some cases, are they widening the gap? Perhaps I'll start with JJ.
I think the perspective that I want to bring in here is not necessarily like the immediate projects I'm working on myself, because it's very much like early stage sort of proof of concept research. What I really wanted to bring in, and that's I guess like sort of what I've seen and experienced on a personal level, is how important it is to have diverse voices in the room represented as you're developing the technology. Because I now am increasingly starting to realize that I think diversity fundamentally drives innovation. And that's not only because when you have people with different backgrounds and expertise and experiences in the room, then they each bring their expertise and perspectives, and you're more likely to come up with better ideas, as well as how to translate those ideas. But it's also, even when you are talking to a bunch of engineers or scientists who are jointly trying to come up with a good idea or something, I think, like going back on the back of the concept of lived experience, like people who bring in their lived experiences will then directly inform what kind of problems are prioritized in the development of that technology, and then what are the immediate patient needs that are represented when you sort of develop that technology. And then so like, I guess having that lived experience, and I think this sort of goes back to the equity and diversity and inclusion issue as well, is that we as women in STEM research, as well as those who are, for instance, ethnically diverse, First Nations peoples, people who have visible and invisible disabilities, are often underrepresented in this field already. And so when their voices are not heard in the room, then you have mainstream people developing mainstream technologies that are not accessible and not equitable for everyone. And then there's also these considerations also of, I guess, like when you're doing the technological development, if you're not already considering things downstream, like with the end user and consumer engagement in terms of affordability, of digital literacy, of, I guess, language accessibility, and of cultural considerations, then your technology is not accessible and not inclusive, and it's not going to address a population-wide problem. It's just going to be addressing a problem for a mainstream group of people.
Thank you, JJ. I just want to add on one is, with this progress of digital technology, I think the opportunity for bringing more equitable society is actually better. So, for example, in the project I described that are for the patch census, we actually have an indigenous community to participate in that. In the past, that maybe get into the remote areas to collect those data is harder. Now, is with some digital technology, at least you can get involved. Having said that, I want to echo what Sally was saying in those design things, is starting the design process with all those, diversity and all those equitable access things in the process to start with is very important. And then now we champion one one new phase which called trust by design. So it's actually, eventually we try to design a solution which is trustworthy and can be, of course, trustworthiness applied to all sorts of people, society, and populations. And if we put those end goal in, is we want people to trust those technology, and then that's the end point. And then, of course, trust and then use, right? And bring those ones into the design process that to safeguard the whole actual process. Yeah.
Sally, I think you would have done a lot of thinking about this from a policy perspective.
Yes, I'm very passionate about equity, diversity and inclusion. I actually chair our faculty committee as well. So I feel like all of the themes that drive my career are all culminating in the conversation today, which is fantastic. Look, from the policy perspective and with new and emerging technologies, what I have learnt in my career of trying to have a new technology or a new way of delivering care embedded into practice and having that trustworthiness and that acceptance of that is really starting at that very beginning point, thinking longer term into that uptake, that sustainability, that implementation, and what the policy frameworks are that need to go around that, as well as the regulatory aspects as well. And I think sometimes we see these as distinct, this is my area, someone else will pick that bit up, and someone else will pick that bit up, and someone else will pick that bit up. So what I'm trying to do in some of the groups that I'm mentoring now is to say, okay, so if this is ultimately what you want practice to look like in 10 or 15 years because it's commonplace, what are those essential steps that need to come to get to that point, right? So think about the research that you're doing now in terms of, with consumers, with clinicians, with policymakers, what will this look like as a guideline or policy? And I think just thinking a few steps ahead of where your research might be, and of course this means bringing in diverse colleagues from different disciplines and backgrounds. The other role of my here at UTS is that I am the health lead for the Digital, Virtual and AI in Health Collaborative at our research institute, Insight. And Insight is all about interdisciplinary research across all of UTS. And so I've been doing this role for a few years now, and we're really building up what Insight is capable of doing. But one of the most critical things that Insight can actually do is bring together people from engineering and IT who've got all of those technical skills, and also people across health, people across business, our health economists, and look at these problems and look at the solutions from that full pipeline perspective and that really interdisciplinary perspective. And I think that's almost where sometimes the uptake and the implementation of new technologies kind of falls over, because everyone's looking at one piece and not looking at the full pipeline of how do we get there. And I think by working together with really diverse groups and different disciplines, we kind of learn from each other and we go, okay, this is my piece I'm doing, then I'm going to hand it over to, I've already got my colleague lined up who's doing the next bit, and working together, because having the evidence and getting that into guidelines and into policy takes a long period of time. But I think if you start off with that's what your goal is in mind, you will know what type of research you have to do to inform whether it's an application to the TGA or to get it into policy and practice.
Terrific, thank you. Thanks, Sally. We have opportunity for questions from the audience. So I see a head first, sir. I apologise, I don't know everybody in the room. I'm just putting that down to the fact that I'm new. Do we have a roving mic? Okay, we'll just pinch this one.
I'm the Chief Technology Advisor with Ageing Australia and the Digital Health Agency. One of the challenges we've always found with this technology is that we've tried to shoehorn the technology into an existing workforce. So whilst we've brought in a lot of the digital tools, we still don't have a digital workforce. What are your thoughts on the need for that innovation in workforce so that the standard model of doctors, nurses, allied health workers, our training is not digital. Our training is in compassionate care, but the digital tools are now becoming a significant part of our way we deliver care.
Yeah. I might jump in on this one. This is also something that I think we do actually do quite well here at UTS, and we're working a lot with our teaching and learning colleagues, particularly in the Faculty of Health, so nursing, midwifery, allied health areas, that, you know, these new technologies, the students are getting exposed to them, either here on campus at UTS in their sort of, you know, learning, or when they go out to practice. But it is really important that as technologies emerge, that students have opportunities to learn about the new technologies. And, you know, this next generation coming through will be, you know, they're much more used to evolving technology. And I think perhaps, you know, from their lens, maybe they go out into the real world sometimes and they go, oh my goodness, look at all these problems. We could have far better solutions to some of them. So I think it's a bit of a two-way thing, I think. We can learn from each other, but I think those new generation coming through have probably also got a lot that they can share from their perspective. But yes, it is very essential that the workforce, and that's the current workforce, as well as the workforce that we're training up now, that it will, you know, carry on for hopefully decades to come, that they are being taught about the technology. But I also think it's important that they also know that, you know, from that sort of entrepreneur sort of perspective, that, and you do see this, you know, where people go, I've seen this problem in the clinical setting, I know a solution, I'm going to develop the solution, and then they have amazing, you know, startups and things that come out of that. So we're at this sort of really critical point, I think, with digital health technology and how that works in the clinical environment. And, you know, once we get things embedded such as, you know, digital records, and, you know, I think we will see that this becomes much more commonplace. I think we're just sort of in this transition phase at the moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting place. Also, I see the business outcome and the co-design of the deployment process is really important. I see a lot of success stories, which is when a certain technology bring into organization, actually we aim at the outcome. Outcome is owned by people, and those people is in the design stage from beginning that identify, in order to get this outcome, what sort of capabilities we need, not only technology, and then we have deployment process in terms of what sort of training needed, what sort of holding hand needed, and then even new talent needed to bring into the organization to sustain those outcomes. Back to the failure I see in some organizations is that we start from little proof of concept without knowing the entire delivery pipeline, and then focus on, okay, let's get this work first, and then without knowing who's going to use that, who's going to take a decision, who's going to integrate those one into the workflow, and the workflow may need to tweak a little bit. In order to tweak workflow, you maybe need some new capabilities to help to change, is have a thorough strategic thinking from end to end really helps.
And who's best to design that thorough strategic pathway?
All the stakeholders.
Together.
So together, yes. Stakeholders from business owners, from data owners, from technology providers, and whoever sponsors, supporters. We used to have a big workshop to start with.
In the co-design.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm a little bit biased in the comments I'm about to say for two reasons. Although I'm industry and innovation, I'm a board member of NSSN, and I'm an adjunct professor here at UTS in the School of Business. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But this is absolutely one of the best sessions on this topic that I've attended in a very long time, because of how real, authentic, and grounded in the actual translation or commercialization and the very wide scope on which you all think. JJ, if anybody was recording what you said about the adaptation by orthopedic surgeons of what you're doing. Brilliant, absolutely an incredible lesson. But I do have a question, which is to broaden the scope a little bit and to ask what we're doing in Australia might be basically being done at the same time in other places in the world, or at least the same problems are being addressed. I used to tell people that if we're doing something in Sydney, it's probably being done in Singapore, Seoul, Shanghai, Boston, and probably a couple of other places. So how do we need to have an eye on, particularly for sustainability and success, on innovation elsewhere? And how do we do that, being at such a great distance, physically and otherwise?
Great question. And I think actually everyone will probably have a view on this one. So Fang, I'll hand to you.
Thank you. Great question. Also great challenge as well. Let's look into the Australian innovation ecosystem. And I'm lucky I'm actually sitting on the board of Industry, Innovation and Science Australia. And of course, there's a broad sense of, I'm not responsible for any budget change today, by the way. I'm just teasing. But our biggest challenge, one is we have a small sample data, relatively, small funding pool, and then the product in our local economy doesn't have a huge base to be applied. Hence, that a lot of a company when grow big has to go overseas. Having said that, the challenge remains the same. I wanted to highlight a few things. One is, the quality of data in Australia, some sectors are superbly good. So we sort of try to champion sovereign data in that space. Of course, we need a sovereign model, or that's a separate conversation. Is how we can collectively working with our international partners on utilizing our data, however, not giving out our data to get the benefit for Australia. That's really a challenging question. And looking at all the different sectors, of course, different stages, talking about critical minerals, we really need to have a lot of refinery, those things, right? For the health record perspective, is we need to have a connected the data sources, which is shared data, interoperability. Those ones are the challenges we even need to address before getting into apply innovation to that. And the last point I want to mention is when we get into the horizon ones, so it's an opportunity we bridge with other states, and the work, Kathleen, we're doing is actually linking OECD, all those AI Act, whatever, in the health sector application, combined with our local TGA and also broadly FDA, all those ones putting together. Eventually, world is global. When we're talking about a compliance perspective, it's not because of the market, we're not only doing here, or the technology, whatever, or vice versa, we need to do globally. Hence, the compliance regulations need to be aware it's a global challenge. So the world is interconnected. We should learn from everyone and of course, utilize our own strength.
I think it's a really hard question to answer. And I think in my field, I cannot really give you a really good answer because, sometimes I do feel like, as Fang said, we have a limited funding landscape, both for basic research, early stage research, and for translational research and commercialization. And sometimes if there is really a innovative technology, the fact is that it will get translated probably faster in places like Singapore, the US, and Asian countries. But I sort of want to bring this back to I guess like from a workforce building perspective, because we know that the current STEM sector, we are losing talent. Like we spend so much money training our undergraduate and postgraduate and research students, only, for many of them to not stay in Australia and not give back to the innovation ecosystem that we have train them for. So I guess it's not an overnight solution, but I think we can all be doing our bits in terms of the people who currently do have access to some funding, who are leading centres of excellence, who are leading translation hubs, to be really actively raising the next generation of researchers and towards diverse career pathways as well, to not only focus on the early stage innovation aspects, but also to train them and to leverage their strengths towards, like regulatory sort of affairs related, patenting, maybe, pitching to people and making business cases. So really sort of training a diverse workforce of people, as well as trying to have different types of people represented in that space, as well as entrepreneurs, as successful people, so that the underrepresented groups aspiring to become that one day can see themselves being represented and can see themselves being successful in those shoes, I think is really important.
Thank you. I think we all, are aware of the challenges with, the current research funding environment. I think it comes back to our community that, we are serving through our research, is that research, needs to be valued and it needs to be invested in. And so where people have a platform and can advocate for, research funding to go into ensuring that we can follow that pipeline all the way through. So the discovery is just as important as those next steps all the way through to the policy and the implementation. And as someone who's now focused on health services research, from a funding point of view, that really is the least successful box to tick when you put in funding applications if you're a health services researcher. But, the wonderful research that happens in the labs and in the technology environment won't actually get into the real world without that health services research that sits around it for implementation and policy and evidence. And regulation and health economics and all of those critical aspects. So I think we all, as a community, have a responsibility to advocate here in Australia that we need to invest and we need to value research. But we also need to have, as we've all mentioned, that those teams that support us all the way through the pipeline. And start off with that in mind, so that we can show that from this piece of research that's funded here, we've already thought ahead of how we're going to get it into practice and into policy. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we do have here in Australia versus maybe other, geographies and economies, is just not necessarily having the funding to support it all the way through. And, things fall off a cliff. And, and then you think, well, what was the value and have we got a return on investment for what we have already supported that research through? So I think it is really important, and of course building people's careers is absolutely critical. For some right now we are really at a crunch point of funding situation. So I think the funding is vital, but it has to be designed also in a way that it is going to flow through that pipeline, and not just be short-term pilot projects that take $1 or $2 million and then it doesn't actually go anywhere from there. We need to invest wisely in the research that we're doing in the digital health space in particular. And there is a new sort of body that's being set up in Australia working with the digital, other digital health groups to look at how digital health is funded and ensuring that it's done and it's designed in a way that is going to, really have an impact, and not necessarily short-term small projects.
Well, I think there's three sets of reflections that's taken us to a fantastic space to understand some of the challenges that we face, but also what we need to be able to address those and how to get there. I think this has been a fantastic session. We've covered not only the technologies themselves, but really brought to the fore the importance of what lies behind them as well, in terms of that partnership, in terms of the co-design, in terms of the genuine diversity of perspectives and interdisciplinarity that's required. So I would like you to please join me in thanking 3 incredible researchers and 3 incredible women on the stage.